Okay, let's get started. This section is on ethical issues associated with generative AI. And there's a lot of and there's not many of us here, so please feel free just to jump in at any point, just send me your notes. And did I not put in a link to the slides? Apparently I didn't. Let me do that. Let me put this right up. There we go. So just as we did last time, I'm going to give you the option of downloading the slides so you can follow along, because I think there are some links in here at the end. So if you could, so let me do this. I'll have it in chat if other people.
Sounding a little odd, John, like you're in a bubble, kind of.
Well, I'm in a bubble. I don't know if it works now. Yeah.
It's kind of hard for me. I don't know if it's me or.
Okay. Well, what else is there? Let's see. Okay. Does my audio sound a little distorted? I wonder if it goes to turn up the other microphone. Shouldn't make a difference.
Is anyone else having a little trouble hearing, or is it just me? Oh, Lisa's saying yes too. Okay.
Okay, is it any better now?
Yes, that's better. Yes.
Okay, apparently we have to keep both mics on in order for it to work okay. I have
Okay.
no idea why that's the case. Okay, so if you could, I'd encourage you just to download these to follow. Because there are some links in them, I'm pretty sure as we go through.
So you might put the link in the chat.
And yeah, let me put the link in the chat too. There we go. Okay, now let me start the recording. Oh, I had started the recording. Okay, let's go back. So we're going to be talking about generative AI and some ethical issues associated with this. And students are going to be using AI going forward. So we might want to be careful to prepare them so that they will use AI ethically in whatever they do after they leave here. And so they use AI ethically while they're here. And because of that, one of the questions is, what can we do to prepare them to use AI in an ethical manner? And also, as part of that, how can we use it ethically? One of the things that comes up a lot in these discussions is faculty are using AI quite a bit in preparing course materials, modifying course materials, and then banning its use by students, which may not be a very ethical thing to do, or at least it's not. It's somewhat problematic from an ethical perspective. But there are some issues that we should be aware of when using AI. The AI tools are trained on mostly publicly available data. Most of the AI producers don't fully reveal what their training database is, but it's trained on a lot of material that's in the public domain and a lot of other material out there on the internet, some of which may be copyrighted, but that's another issue that we'll talk about in just a little bit. But basically, AI tools are trained on essentially the history of human knowledge. There's a vast volume of material that's used to train AI. But we do know that humans have biases, that we have many types of biases, and we could spend a whole day talking about the various types of cognitive biases that we have. But when we look at human created output, and that's being used to train databases, AI will reflect those biases. And there's a lot of examples, and we'll talk a little bit about some of those. Some of the biases are cognitive ones, again, there are hundreds of different, over 100 classified specific types of cognitive bias. And because it's trained on material that was created by people with those biases, it will often reflect that. There's also some sample selection in training data. If the data is based on past results or data from the past, it's going to reflect whatever was true about the selection process. For example, when AI tools are used to select candidates for job interviews, it's going to be using data on who were successful candidates in the past, and if there were biases or discrimination in past hiring practices, that will very easily, very directly show up in the types of selection that will be recommended by the AI tool. So if the data, for example, was biased against women or against underrepresented minorities or other things in past practices, AI tools will reflect whatever types of material, whatever types of hiring criteria we used in the past, and that can result in a perpetuation of bias, which is not the goal we'd like to see in general. Some types of bias. I'll just talk about each of these a little bit. Feel free to click on the links. I linked each of these to at least one article about these things. Amazon, a while back, actually, about a decade or so ago, started using an automated hiring system in trying to recruit, an automated recruitment system in trying to select or recruit potential candidates for tech positions, for programmers and so forth. And one of the things that it did was, again, it reflected past biases. So there was because women tended to be underrepresented in these technical positions at Amazon in the past, when it was looking at data for males and females, it was more likely to assign a higher rating to male applicants than to female applicants, because in the past they were more likely to be hired, even if they had similar observable characteristics other than their gender identification. This was also a really troubling. A private firm put together the correctional offender management profiling for alternative sanctions, or the COMPASS system. And it was basically used based on past evidence of recidivism rates. It tried to predict the probability that a particular defendant in a case would be likely to be a reoffender in the future. And for both white and Black individuals, it correctly predicted the proportion of people who would reoffend. And the proportions were, I believe, 60% for both white and Black candidates in the particular database this was trained on. However, the error rates were substantially different. So on average, it got the correct predictions, that Black candidates or Black defendants were misclassified as being more likely to offend twice as often as white candidates were, and white defenders were misclassified as low risk, 48% versus 48, yeah. I'm sorry, that should read at the bottom for Black candidates. So white candidates were systematically overestimated as being at low risk relative to Black defendants. So on average, it was correct, but the misclassifications were harmful to Black defendants relative to white defendants. I put this together last night. Sorry about the typo, but I should read Black. And there was also a healthcare prediction algorithm that was used in determining the likelihood of treatment needs used for insurance payments and Medicare payments and so forth. And what happened is it used the whole database of white and Black and Hispanic individuals in generating predictions. And it did pretty well, actually, in predicting what type of further treatment was needed for white candidates or white people who were hospitalized with particular conditions. But what happened is Black candidates and Hispanic or Black and Hispanic patients were more likely to have severe chronic conditions because of poor quality healthcare in the past. And it was predicting rates of more serious illness at the same rate for all individuals, even though Black and Hispanic individuals were more likely to need subsequent treatment, and they were being denied subsequent treatment from that. You can read more details about this in the article. And I think many of you probably remember a few years ago in 2016, one of the first AI chatbots out there got a lot of attention because it was put up on Twitter and it learned from Twitter. And this was before Elon Musk took over Twitter and removed its guardrails. But within 24 hours, it went from being a very friendly chatbot to becoming racist, transphobic, sexist, and also, well, it pretty much picked up the worst of what could happen on the web or in discussion forums, or it would fit very nicely in the current release of Twitter, for example. So you know, you can read more about those on those links. But those biases are somewhat, I didn't mean to click that. Those biases are somewhat troubling. And that's the type of thing that may be picked up in some of the stuff. But you know, there is an alternative argument that we know ways in which humans are subject to bias. And there's an interesting article actually by Abrams that came out this spring who suggests that because we can predict the types of bias that humans are likely to make in hiring decisions, in recruitment decisions, in healthcare decisions, and so forth, we could perhaps program that into AI systems so that they're aware of the bias in the past database and they could make adjustments for that. And so, you know, AI tools can magnify or can perpetuate bias, but it also potentially could correct bias if it is programmed to take that into account. And, you know, that's one of the areas in which I hope we see more work. That has not been a major focus in most of these, although Google has gotten some attention in its Gemini AI product because it was built with guardrails that essentially encourage it to provide overrepresentation of underrepresented groups in imagery and in other types of contexts. Some of which, for example, when it was asked to generate, I think it was Gemini, when it was asked to generate images of representative founding fathers of the country, it created a very diverse racial mix, which was not actually accurate for the time period when slavery was legal. So, but certainly we can go a lot further in correcting for the biases that exist there. Another issue where we have some really substantial concern, well, potential concerns, is copyright. And there have been some cases which have made this really substantial or has really amplified this issue. There are lawsuits against pretty much all of the major AI platforms on the grounds that it essentially has ingested a lot of content which is not public domain or not released under a Creative Commons license. For example, you can ask AI tools to play the role of characters in popular books and so forth, and generate content from there. And sometimes it will take phrasing that's remarkably close to those in the original books and so forth. This is especially true with image generation software, where there have been a lot of lawsuits and a growing number of lawsuits from the use of trademarks and other materials that show up in images created by DALL-E and by Midjourney and all the other image generation platforms. And groups of artists have essentially challenges, and there's some class action suits against them. And well, we can just look at a few examples of this. Getty Images versus Stability AI, for example, has noted that when images are generated that are similar to images that are in Getty's database, and they have a huge database, all of which is subject to copyright, a somewhat deformed versions of Getty's watermark will show up in some of those images, which certainly suggests that, essentially it's just taking the images from Getty and just twisting them a little bit, but it's still ultimately content from the original source materials. And visual artists in general, as a class action suit, has a class action suit against Stability, Midjourney, and DeviantArt. Three of the major producers of image generation software. And there was also a class action suit by programmers against GitHub, which is owned by Microsoft now, OpenAI, for unauthorized use of programmers' code that most AI tools can generate fairly efficient code that looks remarkably like the code that's been stored online, but is, again, the creative product of individuals, and it's being used perhaps without their permission, or at least that's the claim of each of these, and there are dozens of other cases here. But, one of the issues, one of the counter arguments to all this is that, there's that classic phrase, which actually dates back for centuries, but it was Isaac Newton was most known for when he noted that he only got as far as he did because he was standing on the shoulders of giants and so forth. And creative work is not entirely new and innovative. It comes from what we've learned from other sources and so forth. A simple form. Now, there are several apps out there that will generate music. It will even generate voices that will sing the lyric to accompany, that were created to accompany the music that it generated. There's some really great videos out there. The music may not be the highest quality yet, but it's the fact that it can do this at all is fairly impressive. But in Western music, we only have 12 semitones. The basic notes on the keyboard, for example, or the points on the frets on the guitar. And in each of our major and minor keys and all the various modes, there's only 8 notes, which limits the possible combinations that can be used for music. And in particular, many genres of music, for example, 12-bar blues uses a very standard chord progression that it persists throughout the whole song. And there's also the changes, which were extremely popular in the late 1950s and early 1960s, which shows up in dozens of popular songs of that genre. And, because of that, it's pretty easy for computers or AI tools to simulate that. But again, that's what musicians do. That the most creative musicians learned what other people did, and they built on it. And in a sense, that's really what AI tools are doing. If we think about art, for example, before the most great artists started by studying the work of previous artists, and they copied their work, and they learned how they did it. They learned how they used light and perspective and such things. And then they went on from there, but it was building on prior work. And the same is true with most research, and there's some interesting issues in terms of history. For example, calculus was developed both in England and in Germany by Newton and Leibniz, essentially at the same time, even though they were not in direct correspondence. But elements of it had appeared before in Egypt, Greece, China, and the Middle East in terms of some of the concepts that became part of modern calculus. So, these things occurred at the same time because there was a need to go beyond what was done, but it all built on material that people developed and learned from in the past. It's not entirely novel or new. In a sense, it's a next logical progression. Although it was a big leap, it was still just an extension of past work. Darwin and Wallace both came up with a theory of evolution at the same time. Darwin is known as the creator of this only because he happened to be in England at the time and was able to get the paper before the Royal Society, before Wallace returned from, I think he was in South America. He was somewhere else at the time, and they had shared notes and so forth. But Darwin came up with the theory of evolution, or his book, The Theory of Evolution, well before Wallace had a chance to publish any of his work. But it was closed, and it was only because Darwin was encouraged to rush his work out that we think of Darwin as a creator of this. In economics, this may not be as well known, but in the 1930s and early 1940s, up until that point, the models of economics were focused on competitive market analyses, where we assume competitive markets with lots of buyers and sellers, no individual buyer or seller was able to affect the price. It didn't seem to work quite as well by the time of the Great Depression and so forth. Edward Chamberlain in England, and Joan Robinson in the US came up with essentially identical theories to explain what happened when you don't have firms producing standardized products, when you had product differentiation, where you have where firms have some control over the prices they charge, and they were not producing everything at the same price as the competitive model suggested. And those models came out basically at the same time, independently in two countries. And there are so many cases in history where new ideas evolved at the same time, but they all built on past knowledge and so forth. And the main point I want to make here is that when we create things, we're doing it based on knowledge from the past. And that's essentially what AI tools are doing. They may not be as creative as human beings, but they're basically creating new material based on what's been learned in the past from humans. Now, there may be some concern in the future where AI tools may be trained partly on other things generated by AI, but there is at least many people discussing the possibility that training databases should not include AI-generated work, so it doesn't become this sort of recursive degeneration of knowledge. But it's an interesting thing to at least consider. One ethical issue, though, in terms of the use of AI tools is privacy. And one thing we have to be careful about is the privacy position of the AI tools that we use. And if you have students use AI tools, or if you use AI tools with students where you submit some of their work to detect whether they may have used AI generation and so forth, AI tools to generate the work, we should be careful that it's not containing personal information that could become part of the data of the database of future AI content. And in general, a lot of the material we have out there in the web can become used by AI tools. In fact, one of the things I recommend, if you have the paid version of ChatGPT, or if you have even the free version of Claude, is to ask it to generate a biography of yourself, just to see how much it knows about you. We probably don't want to feed students personal information into something without their permission, so that they become part of the training database. And that is an issue where, again, it goes back partly to the copyright issue we've talked about before, but we should just be really careful to remove any personally identifying information in anything we submit, unless we know that the material is owned by us, or that information is owned by us and is not becoming part of the training database. And in general, with any of the free AI tools out there, there is a pretty high likelihood that any material submitted could be used for future training and so forth. Now, another issue associated with personal privacy, which is becoming increasingly of concern, is that voice synthesis, image synthesis, and video creation is becoming or AI tools are becoming fairly sophisticated at this, that the videos they create, voices that they create, and imagery they create can look incredibly realistic. And that's improving by leaps and bounds every month, it seems. And one of the concerns with that, especially in a political time, is the generation of deep fakes. You know, last year we saw some issues where people modified videos of either candidate to make it look like they were fumbling, or they were stumbling, or they were, or just making them look bad in some way. But now you don't really even need the original video to edit. You can just create your own where people are saying things which is not something that they would say. And this is becoming more and more common. And certainly there have been lots of deepfake created where imagery was used to essentially create porn movies from people who were not involved in the production of pornography. And that's an issue that is becoming of increasing public concern, as well as political uses of this to create new realities for people who are locked into particular candidates. So Google once had the motto, don't be evil. They abandoned that in 2018. And I think that's also true of most of the AI creators today. None of them have the motto of don't be evil. So if you're going to be using AI tools, be aware of data privacy. What data is kept privately and what data becomes part of the training database. Read over those license terms that you normally just click buy and so forth. And again, don't share other people's personal data, especially student data, well, including student data. And make sure that users control their own data. And this is an issue where there's a lot of talk about in terms of legislation and so forth. And it's also one of the reasons why a number of colleges, a growing number of colleges, instead of relying on the public versions of ChatGPT or other tools, are creating their own instances where they own the data, essentially, where the data doesn't become part of the broader databases of the commercial versions of ChatGPT or other tools. Because if you own it, you can control it, you can control what gets added to the database and what becomes publicly shared and so forth. There's an interesting discussion of Top Hat's new AI tool. Top Hat is a polling software company with really obnoxious salespeople who, once they get your name, will be sending you emails and making phone calls dozens and dozens of times every time when it's coming up to the start of a new semester. And I haven't used the tool, but the tool basically comes with OER material, or their product also includes OER materials and questions generated from that in the past from OER materials tailored for specific courses. But now their new version, or they have a new version of the tool, which has been used in a number of institutions. And Derek Bruff had a podcast on this about 2 or 3 weeks ago, interviewing someone who is using the new version of Top Hat that used the AI tool, where basically if you give it some training material, maybe a chapter of a textbook or some readings and so forth that you have in your LMS or stored within the Top Hat system, it will generate questions that would then be given to students and so forth. So it's essentially doing that, but it also served as a personal tutor for students so that students could ask questions about material they didn't understand that was trained specifically on the course material. So essentially it became a personal tutor for students trained on the basis of course material and other OER materials in the discipline, which is kind of interesting. And I know the SUNY chancellor and the provost are looking at ways in which AI can be used to provide personal tutoring services for students, which are, again, maintaining the privacy of students' data. And that's one of the things that there's been discussions of using the Empire AI program, which is New York State's AI platform, which is housed at the University of Buffalo and Albany and, well, the university centers, as well as I think Penn State and a few other institutions are part of that collaborative. Another issue, and we talked about this with people who were here last time, is hallucinations. That AI systems work by essentially looking at patterns of words and predicting the next word and the next sentence based on what comes before and what they've observed in terms of probabilities that new words will be based on other words. And sometimes that will generate completely bizarre content. And that's especially true if you do not provide a very specific prompt. Some examples of this. If you ask most of the AI tools to draw human beings, it's really common to get 4 to 7 fingers on a hand. That seems to be pretty uniformly distributed, where 5 fingers is just as likely as 4 or 6 or 7, etc. And so while they're doing pretty well with faces generally, they don't do so well with fingers for whatever reason. If you ask the free version of ChatGPT to write a paper on a topic, and then include in that it provides footnotes and a bibliography, the footnotes will generally, or the bibliography, sometimes they match, sometimes they don't, but the references that I cite are generally the names of authors in the field. And they might even combine different authors who have written about the field, even if they haven't written anything together. And they will generate paper titles that are similar to papers that have been written in the field, but generally don't exist at all. So at least with the free version of ChatGPT, those references are generally completely fictitious. It's very rare that it actually happens to include a correct one. On the other hand, if you use the paid version now, the 4.0 Omni, it will generate citations that actually exist, and it will put a citation to the website where it found those materials, because it does do a web search and it maintains track of where the data came from. So it is doing a bit better with this. And there's other AI tools that actually search databases of research publications, and it will generate accurate bibliographies and so forth. Now, I just put in a link to one such case, but there's been at least a dozen cases where lawyers submitted briefs to a judge that were generated by AI and that were completely fictitious in terms of citations. It cited cases and case laws or laws that simply didn't exist based on its prediction algorithms. And some lawyers have actually been sanctioned for that and ended up paying fines and so forth. And it certainly hasn't helped their cases when they submit references that were made up. Michael Cohen actually was someone who had done this in one case, in one of the articles, but there's many cases. If you just put in a search, Google for lawyers submitting hallucinated sources or AI hallucinated sources, you'll find many examples. This, though, suggests another way in which we could give students an assignment where you ask them to generate a paper, knowing that the sources will be made up, and then ask them to go through and critically evaluate the arguments, find sources to document it, and perhaps to write a revised version of the paper with accurate citations, and also making sure that the claims in the paper are actually supported by evidence. And one form of hallucination is that ChatGPT will sometimes generate statements in a paragraph that contradict each other. So, at one point, it will say something happens, and the other is, well, this never happens in response to this stimulus or whatever. So have students go through, analyze this, and clean it up, verify it, document it, and so forth, because that's a really useful skill for them to have in interpreting the output of AI tools. Now, one of the questions is, who is the author material? We talked about this a little bit in the last session, but MLA and most others treat it essentially as personal communication, because if you type the exact same prompt into ChatGPT at 2 different times or 2 different people submit it, you'll get some similarities between the responses, but each one will be different. So you can never verify the source of the material. You can't go back and reproduce it, Even if students, gave you the prompt that they use, you'll get something different than what they happen to include, which makes AI detection a little bit more challenging too, because you can never really prove it. Turnitin boasts a 98% rate with the free versions of detection, with the free versions of ChatGPT. And that's true if they use simple prompts and the person is a native English speaker. There's a tremendous amount of false positive though, if someone is not a native English speaker. And there's some references that I'll share at the end. So it's basically makes it difficult to verify the sources and so forth, or to prove that something was generated by AI. Poor responses could be generated by students just as easily as by AI. One of the other issues is that under legal decisions so far, no one technically owns a copyright to AI generated materials, or images. Any of the producers of those do not claim copyright of the material they generate, but nor do the people who generated the prompts have copyright. This is an issue which is going to be subject to a lot of legal discussions because it's a brand new area that's really never been addressed before substantially. So there's going to be a lot of case law generated over the ownership of this material in the future. And I guess that's it, but let me see, I also included in here, and apparently I did not put in the link, let me do that right now. There's a link which I will add to this, which you can get from here. So I'm going to go down and share. Let me stick AI in this. So let me create the QR code, copy that, and let me put it in. Apparently, I'm going to work on this more today. So let me duplicate that slide and put references here. Yeah, you spell it correctly. That's one way of detecting human content versus AI. We make typing errors and apparently repeatedly. Let me get rid of this. And we want to put in the QR code right here. So there's a QR code that takes you to the references, and we can look at those references now. Right here. Here's just some examples of bias, some articles discussing some of the bias that was mentioned, when we went through this. There's many more, just put a few representative ones. This article, this was 2023, discussed some of the current AI copyright cases. This is the article which referred to the possibility of using AI to correct for human biases. And here's just a couple of links to some of the AI generated text. And this talks, the NYU libraries page talks about different citation styles and formats in different citation styles. So we can open for any questions, comments, thoughts, or observations. And this article, which just came out, was updated in April, addresses a lot of the equity and ethical issues in AI. So any thoughts or questions or concerns? It's an evolving area. Any thoughts, any observations? Well, apparently I did not, when I created that document, I did not make it shareable. Let me fix that. This was the last one I worked on last night. So let me make it shareable, but yeah, sorry about that. Anyone with the link, you should be able to get it now with that code. And again, the code is right there. So if you get a new version of these slides, it will include this link.
John, on the slideshow that I copied, the QR code for the references, I'm not seeing it on the. I clicked on the link to copy it. No, I'm not. I think it came up though on my phone. So I think the reference, there's two QR codes, right? One is to download the copy of the slideshow and the other is the references.
Let me put the direct link in the chat to the references. I thought I had done that. I did it with the two other slides, 3 other sets of slides last night. So, and there's many more. These were just some representative ones I found as I was putting this together. Somewhere, anyway. So.
Got it. Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
Well, any other thoughts? It's a rapidly evolving area, and it's something society has to address. The European Union is pursuing perhaps a little bit more rapidly than the US. It seems to be hard to get political consensus on many things, on anything in the US today, and certainly ways of regulating AI among those. One of the concerns that comes up, this isn't directly related to ethical issues, but students are reading less. And one of the concerns with AI tools is that, this is something Mark Rawson has been bringing up in his blog post, is that some of the basic skills that students have may break down a bit if they don't use those skills. And students, since the pandemic, has cut back dramatically on the amount of time they spend reading course materials. And they can document that by looking in learning management systems and so forth. And there have been a lot of studies of that. And AI offers a convenient shortcut, especially Claude, where you can take whole articles or even books, paste them into it, and ask for a 2 or 3 page summary of it. It's sort of like an automated Cliff's Notes version of it. So if you give students reading assignments, they can generate output or a summary of it. And if you ask questions of them in class about that material, they can very well direct those questions to the summary and get a pretty nice summary from Claude or even ChatGPT if it's a shorter document.
I have a quick question.
Sure.
So it seems like, most of the lawsuits that we have seen, those are against all these companies who are involved in generative AI. But have you come across some lawsuit that actually goes against those people who is doing, for example, if I create and say that involve, there's some copyright issue. So are there any instances that actually lawsuits was against me, not against just
Right, yeah, if you use AI and it grabs some copyrighted material, it generally rephrases it pretty well. It's mostly when there's specific dialogues or other things coming up there, or when it uses character names or product names or trademarks, and it's more common with imagery. But you could ask any of these tools to generate a story involving Harry Potter, for example. And some of those stories could only be generated if they had knowledge of the whole Harry Potter series of books, which meant somehow that became part of that copyrighted material became part of its training database, which, is difficult to prove, but it's difficult to prove in that it's not directly taking words from there, but it's rewriting in a style similar to that. And one of the fun things to do with any of these tools is to ask it to write an essay on a topic and then ask it to rewrite it as if it was written in the style of Harry Potter, or to rewrite it as a haiku, or to rewrite it in the style of Hemingway, or to rewrite it in the style of some other writer and so forth. And it will do generally pretty decent job of doing that, which means it had to have access for some of those things. And many of the materials that it's basing us on are not in the public domain or released under Creative Commons. So somehow it grabbed material that was copyrighted and it's using that to generate it, which makes it a very powerful tool, but there's also some serious ethical issues associated with that. So, but yeah, and if you post material that was copyrighted or the trademark or whatever, generated by this, you would be the person who would get in trouble for doing that. And again, that's especially true with imagery. So, any other thoughts, concerns, or issues? Okay, well, this was a shorter one, because there was machine to prepare this. We'll be, in the next session, we're going to be talking about first policies, and that we put a bit more work into. So sorry about this short one, but these are all issues to be thinking about in any case.
Very helpful. This conversation are very necessary for us.
Yeah.
And I would encourage everyone to play with these tools just to see what they can do. Because our students play with them. And we should be aware of what can be used with these. And also, as we talked about in the last section, submit some of your assignments to these and see how AI will respond, because you might see those types of responses. And you may want to use that in terms of how you design your assignments. But it's a constantly evolving field. And one of the concerns we had in terms of selecting a book for this was that, for the reading group, was that it was most of the AI books out there became obsolete before they went to print because it's evolving so quickly. But the one we did select, AI, what was it, using AI in education or something like that, that we'll be reading this fall, it's written in a way that should persist. It should be valid for at least a year or so, because it's not referring specific tools and capabilities. It's talking about general ways in which we can use AI. It does it really, really well. Okay, so